What do you think that we can do to influence U.S. policy against relative to Israel? I mean, I feel like the trend has been going in the right way, at least in the Democratic Party, but it goes very, very, very slowly. I mean, like it's...
And certainly not with the Biden administration.
Well, I mean, you know, I don't think the Biden administration wants to deal with any of it, frankly, it seems to me.
But he's got a bone to pick with Netanyahu, though, in a way that like a lot of other folks don't. Like Netanyahu went out of his way early on in the Obama administration to humiliate then Vice President Joe Biden. And I don't think, you know, yes, he's uncle friendly. I don't think that's his favorite thing.
Well, I mean, like, show it then. Show it. Don't keep the embassy in Jerusalem. Don't just default that to that position. I mean, don't send Ned Price and Tony Blinken out there to parrot Israeli talking points. I've got zero sympathy for how the Biden administration has conducted themselves thus far.
I don't think it's a question of sympathy, but it's, I mean, just as a pure analysis, I just don't think they care.
Which is furthering the cultural, like the ethnic cleansing and the apartheid. If you don't care, you are as complicit as the people who are a part of it. I think from the perspective of, like, you know, what can we do about it? I do think, like, you know, political pressure. It's just it's one of those things where the Biden administration, they just don't address things unless it comes up as a potential liability for them not to. And
Sam, do you think that they just know that Netanyahu's on a sinking ship and they're just going to let him sink because the geopolitics is just too complicated? I mean, don't forget also there's the Turkey dynamics and how, I'm not saying it's because I'm a Greek, but Biden is extremely close to Greece, like extremely, it's his closest constituency. They give the most money to him. He's very, very close to Greek constituency. And that's played into his Turkey dynamics, which obviously is playing into the dynamics of Israel. I mean, like, I'm very curious. It's a complicated scenario. I'm curious if they're just betting that Netanyahu's on a sinking ship.
I don't think, I mean, I think Netanyahu may be on a sinking ship, but I just don't think that they want to avoid this issue to the extent that they can, because they think it's probably intractable, that there is no value politically for him getting involved. He probably sees like a huge domestic, but the problem is that this gives Netanyahu room to do this stuff that he's doing now, which very well may save him domestically.
I mean, I would agree that it is indifference that's driving this. And I would also agree with Emma that indifference is going to allow a lot of awful things to happen. But we do, I think, there is a shift that's interesting politically, right? We see, rather than trying to get points for engaging on the wrong side, disengaging, obviously no medals handed out for that. But the other thing that I think is interesting from a cultural perspective is this is the first time that I have been on social media, and there has been one of these things where I haven't been surprised by some of my Jewish relatives, where I'm like, whoa, didn't realize you were like ultra conservative on Israel and nothing else in your life, in that same way that I get shocked over and over again. I remember 2009, I think, in the incursion into Lebanon was the first time I was on Facebook, and I was like, whoa, a full quarter of my relatives are absolutely batshit on this issue. I don't see it this time, and I don't think it's that they've all defriended me. I do think there's more of a reluctance.
I totally agree. I mean, I think you're definitely seeing. I think the elected leaders are behind the American public, are trailing, you know, acutely in this, and I think it's honestly just a matter of time where the Democratic Party basically says we are for cutting funding to Israel. I mean, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, but it is definitely heading in that.
Once there's no land left.
Yeah.
Well, at one point, Israel ends up being isolated, because without American support there, it becomes it starts to look a lot like South Africa.
Well, it's already South, but the urgency is that they can't let this continue, because then they will annex everywhere, and then that's where the negotiation points will start. Once in 20 years, presidents.
But we're
AOC
already
cuts
past
the
that.
whatever.
That's the point. Is that they can annex the entire West Bank. It is a one-state solution now. That's the thing. Is that the two-state solution? The point where you're talking about, where there's no return, that was 10 years ago. We're past that point now where the facts on the ground have won out. Their whole strategy has won out, which is why it has to be a one-state solution now. And that one-state solution is only going to come about, it seems to me, when they are isolated in the way that South Africa was in the mid to 80s, and when all of a sudden, like, their support is gone, and they are isolated, and then it also becomes sort of a dangerous situation, right? Because South Africa did not have a nuke, and South Africa did not have the ability to create a narrative domestically that there were also external enemies that were,
there aren't a ton of South African identifying people in the United States that have this like incredibly emotional response to this. And a second constituency that's even probably more insidious, which is, like the evangelical Christians in this country who push this narrative in the further extreme ways than, obviously. Jewish Americans are one of the most progressive voting blocs in this country. it's not, that's my point. But I'm saying when the Democratic Party gets to that point where they're going to cut off the aid, it is because of the changes. You're still going to have this rump of the evangelical Christian Zionists, but they're not playing a role in the Democratic Party. Ultimately, what's going to happen is the fact that, Aaron's relatives and just, the Jews that I'm surrounded with too have a far less knee-jerk response to coming to Israel's defense in these situations. Pelosi and Steny Hoyer just censored Ilhan Omar like 2 years ago.
But they're also 85.
And their kids are not that way, and their kids who are going to inherit their seats are not that way. And also, I don't even know if it's the voting population. I think it's the money. You look at the reason why Keith Ellison, let's just reinforce this, why we had a Tom Perez and not a Keith Ellison, is because there's a massive smear effort by Alan Dershowitz, who threatened to leave the Democratic Party if Keith Ellison were elected. And P.S., he still left the Democratic Party. So let's just remember, what a shame, guys. Poor Alan Dershowitz,
lost a good one,
who can't get a table at the new hot spot in Cambridge, is shamed because he's come on. But that's really what it is. It's like the curtain's being pulled back, and it's the money. So until that money is out of the party, which we know the party will exist without that 1/5 of its, the DNC building, right, was basically funded by ultra-Zionists, many of whom I'm sure supported Trump this last election.
Well, I think the thing is that you see Tim Kaine, Tim Kaine not going to when Netanyahu came in and addressed Congress and a couple of other sides. But when Tim Kaine did that, it really struck me as like, there's going to be the clock is ticking. It's really just a question of what we can do is speed it up. Because that's the way. The question was, it was in response to the question of what can we do? What can we do is basically push back against our representatives and make them see that to the extent that they think, and I think a lot of this is inertia, that there is a sort of a line I can't cross in criticizing Israel or voting to in any way imply that we would tie our $3-4 billion worth of military aid to the way that they use that military aid. I think there's a lot of that's inertia, and I think a lot of it is literally generational. And when this generation, who are now literally in their 70s and 80s, when they are gone from leadership, I think it's a completely different ballgame in the Democratic Party. And then if the Democratic Party is in a position of power, Israel's going to, they know they're going to pay a price for not responding in these situations. And these situations are not going to end. I mean,
although AIPAC has spent a lot of money on recruiting the next generation, the Richie Torreses, the Ruben Gallegos, certain people who appear more progressive on the surface on 90% of the issues, but support Israel in the end. The only thing that I will say is they don't have the backbones. They don't have the support structures, the external, Nancy Pelosi had a generation that was just ultimately more conservative. And Richie Torres and Cory Booker and Ruben Gallego, all under 40, except for Cory Booker, they all don't have that. They're going to have to respond to the external pressure because they're weak sauce. I'm telling you, Richie Torres, listen to me. You're younger than me. You're weak sauce. You're weak sauce. If you come out with that because you took a trip to AIPAC to Israel with them and they paid for your hotel and you had some hummus and get real. The clock is ticking. You might be hot right now in Congress, but where you live in New York, you're weak sauce.
Well, the bottom line is, and it's not even, I think, I think conservative is not the thing. I can tell you that in my generation, I was raised and was my Hebrew school education consisted of three things: learning the Hebrew alphabet, the Holocaust, and Israel. That was it. And these two were inexorably tied. And so, you would see images of bodies stacked up and driven into graves by bulldozers. And then you would see images of these people, to the extent that there was anybody left in their families, moving to Israel. But the whatever you want to refer to it as, and some people may find this too idealistic, but I can tell you just in terms of I'm talking about what our education was. The dream of, and remember, it was founded by a lot of socialists, right? And there was a massive socialist contingency. That dream died at one point. And I would say probably, somewhere in the 70s is when that dream ultimately died. And I don't think people realized it until a little bit later. And
I would say we've been oversold that dream, I think, as American Jews a bit, and out of guilt for the fact that most of the Jews fleeing Europe would have rather gone anywhere else but Palestine. And in fact, tried very hard to go to other major world capitals that reminded them of the places they were from: Vienna, Berlin, Amsterdam, which was not, the same as burgeoning Tel Aviv.
Without a doubt. I mean, that dream itself may have been, a total myth to begin with. But regardless of how real or fake it was, that's what we were sold. And then two things happened. I mean, I think the Reagan era neoliberalism began to undercut the socialism that was at the founding of Israel, and the absorption of many hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants who were coming from a society that was more authoritarian, and they were Israel was using them as a way of providing a buffer essentially, and to just get more facts on the ground, as it were. They were given, they were the original settlers, or at least part of that cohort, and they brought with them, not exclusively, but they brought with them some very conservative, authoritarian perspectives, because that was the culture they had grown up in, and so here we are, really disturbing. I mean, I find it just incredibly depressing and disturbing.